So, in today's Art of Supply interview, we're bringing back one of our favorite and now officially our most frequently returning guest, Samir Kapadia. He's the managing principal at Vogel Group and also the founder and CEO at India Index. So, Samir, welcome back.
Kelly, I always love speaking to you and your viewers and guests about the dynamic things happening in DC. Thanks for having me again.
Absolutely. Now, you and I in the past have dug into a lot of the details around global supply chains, the impact of tariffs, but I thought you had an interesting idea when we last spoke, and it was actually to stop and take a step back and look at all of this from a much bigger picture, kind of looking at the ideas around how trade and lobbying as a whole work. And directly relevant to that is your background and current position. So, can you kind of get us started with what you're doing today, and then we'll sort of move into that bigger picture of trade and lobbying.
Absolutely, and once again, always great to talk to the Art of Supply guests about all things trade and politics. As way of background, I've been managing principal and a founder of a lobbying and government affairs firm here in Washington for the past 11 years or so. So helping companies navigate DC on matters of trade, manufacturing, foreign direct investment. And I built a career bringing people to government to go and talk about what they need, or in some cases, what they don't need. And on the other side of the coin, for the past 5-6 years, been advising companies on how to move supply chains to India,
Yep.
which, as you've seen in the news and with some of the tremors in public policy, has become a pretty attractive supply chain destination if you're able to look through a clear lens. And so I found a company called India Index, which is free to Art of Supply members, where you can go and vet Indian suppliers at scale and with speed. So I keep myself very busy these days.
I guess you do. And it's funny, I laugh in my mind at the word tremors. So I will trust that you'll have full discretion on what you want to say in response to this question. But I have to ask, what does being in this role mean that your day-to-day life is like right now?
It is fast paced, to say the least. I think just in this week, I've been at the White House. I've been at the Bureau of Industry and Security within the U.S. Department of Commerce. I've been at the United States Trade Representative. I've met with about a dozen or so congressmen and senators, and with trade associations at their headquarters, talking to their members around how they should be navigating some of these trade agreements that are ensuing. So in this climate of being a trade professional in Washington, expect to be in an Uber for about half of the day. And then the other half of it, sitting in rooms, making cases of why
Yeah.
people either should be not paying tariffs or how other people should be paying tariffs. I think it's something that is happening in high velocity and high
Yeah.
volume.
So you just listed out a whole bunch of different types of people, roles, organizations, groups that you're regularly meeting with. I think that's a really good transition. Sort of first, let's take on the trade, and we'll get to the lobbying piece second. So when we think about trade, right, even though most of us in business think of it on one level as being between companies, there's also a piece of it clearly these days that's between the countries that those companies are located in. What would you say is the balance of involvement in trade between private business and then the countries that those businesses are located in and among?
It's a terrific question, and it's full of nuance in the ways that countries only like to affiliate themselves with companies when it serves to their advantage as
Yeah.
it relates to trade policy, and vice versa. I'll give you an example. Right now, you have a whole array of companies that say are in the apparel sector that do a lot of business in Vietnam for footwear
Yep.
and for various apparel and garments product categories. They are lobbying for themselves right now. They are not lobbying alongside the Vietnamese government.
Yeah.
It does not serve to their benefit to attend any meeting with, say, the ambassador of Vietnam to say, "Hey, we all want you to lower the tariffs on the export of Nike shoes," for instance. In those cases, they're not working together. But in some cases, they are working together.
Yeah.
Take, for example, an announcement that came out not too long ago, just in the past week, between Nippon Steel of Japan
Yep.
and their acquisition of U.S. Steel.
Yeah.
Before, Nippon Steel went at their own as a foreign direct investment from a private sector company, and that turned out not to do so well for them. In fact, not only President Biden had blocked it, they retracted their CFIUS, or Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, application. And Mr. Trump, upon getting in office, also said that he was going to decline this opportunity for the Japanese to come in and buy a legacy U.S. asset to invest in the United States. But what happened? You had the announcement of the reciprocal tariffs, and then this laundry list of countries that were now in line to show this quid pro quo
Mm,
of what they were going to do so that they could lower this tariff burden. And it just so happened that Nippon Steel, as a Japanese company, and the Japanese government were truly aligned to have that conversation together. So they went in together and said, as part of our holistic US Japan relationship, our Japanese company of pride is going to invest $14 billion to capitalize your steel industry. And all the meanwhile, we're going to do all these other things. So somehow, Nippon Steel got done through the back door because country and company cooperated together.
yeah.
In many other circumstances, that is not the case. In the case of, say, an apparel importer and a Vietnam, a Cambodia, or Malaysia, I guarantee you, Kelly, they are not walking into the same room together.
Yeah. Now, we're thinking about it at the country level, but certainly within the US, there's also potentially the involvement of state governments. Is this often happening at the federal and state level? Is there interaction here at the levels?
Yeah. So right now, all of the interactions you're seeing are between the federal governments of each country. So you have the ambassadors that are from these foreign countries that are sitting down with Jameson Greer, who's the United States Trade Representative Ambassador, and in some cases, Scott Bessent, the United States Treasury Secretary, to go and negotiate a quid pro quo around the economics of trade. And we find that those conversations really play into three different buckets. They're around foreign direct investment. We talked about that with the Japan transaction, where the United States is saying, "Hey, X country, you need to invest in the United States." The second one is, "Hey, X country, you need to purchase things from the United States." So whether that's agricultural goods, petroleum products, defense platforms,
Mm,
and then the last one is, "Hey, you need to create more market access to the United States." So if you have all these tariffs on us exporting stuff to your country, you're going to reduce those so that we have this kind of symbiosis of foreign direct investment. You're buying a bunch of our stuff, and now we can sell you more of our stuff in the private sector because the barriers to entry have now lowered.
yeah.
That only can be played out at a federal level. State governments can't really participate in that to a degree. They're probably more on the downstream execution side of things.
Okay.
So say if Nippon Steel, upon making this investment in X state, say if they're, just for example, say they're going into West Virginia or Georgia or Alabama, there would absolutely be a conversation with that state government to get things like incentives, or to
Mm,
get things like permitting, or to get things like regulatory clearances done on an expedited manner. So while there might be some coordination at what we call a state level, all of this is being played at the federal government level. That's
okay.
where the ball game is.
Yeah. Now, it's funny because this almost takes me back to like the days of COVID where everybody looked at supply chain and said, "Right, where's my stuff?" So
Mm.
it's one thing to think about dollars being exported, dollars being imported. What is the rate of tariff that we're looking at? But when you think about trade flows as sort of a professional focus, are those the same terms and metrics that are being used in your conversations, or is there sort of a less of a Amazon where is my stuff kind of angle on talking about that those of us that are more casual observers might not otherwise come across?
So the president of the United States and his administration are pretty, I would say, uh, basic about what they're requesting from these countries. They want massive purchases of, say, soybeans,
Yep.
or purchases of LNG, or foreign direct investment, so that they could, emerge into an announcement that they can say up on the stage in the White House press room. So in that sense, there's very what I'd call very basic stuff that they're looking for. But under the sheets, there's a lot of what I call cross currents of activity that will inevitably dictate trade flow. And there are a few
Okay.
examples of that. For instance, um, labor rights and environmental standards are core components of trade negotiations. For instance, within the United States Mexico Canada agreement, initially under the first President Trump's first administration, there were all of these standards that were set within the text of that trade deal that said, oh, and if you're going to export things to the US, you need to follow these labor practices and you need to follow these environmental practices. Sure, you need to stay within historical averages of certain exports.
Yeah.
You can't dump things into our country at cheaper rates than you're making them so we can protect domestic industry. But there are these kind of nodes of negotiation around standards, which are very important. And if a country doesn't abide by those standards, then there are punitive measures that are then taken or remedies that are instituted to level that playing field.
Yeah.
There's also the emergence under the Trump administration in particular, and what I imagine to be a massive trend that will occur over the next 6 months are export restrictions from the United States itself. Meaning we as the United States of America are now going to limit other countries' access to our stuff. Now, what stuff could that be? Well, you got to think smart, and the natural area that you would go into is things that affect the national security of
Yeah, I
the
was going to say military stuff.
yeah. And
Yeah.
so, we don't want our defense platforms going into the wrong hands. And that's largely dictated by something called FMS, foreign military sales. There's a lot of countries like India, for instance, that want to get access to US defense technology. And we're going to maybe open the doors on some items and maybe monitor with close oversight where we could open doors on the future on other things. But then you have industries that have just really taken off, Kelly. Like, look at the semiconductor industry,
Yeah.
and look at chips, and look what's happening with the artificial intelligence ecosystem and data centers and Chat GPT and OpenAI. Well, look, there are companies that now have become household names like NVIDIA. I guarantee you, the United States of America right now is going through a giant process of determining how much of our what we call American innovation
Mhm.
is going into the hands of foreign adversaries for the sake of capitalism or profiteering
Yeah.
at the expense of national security. And that, once again, are one of the things that don't really get talked about in terms of, well, how many soybeans did they buy or how much LNG did they purchase? These things are also being included in the trade negotiations to say, I'm going to either expand or I'm going to limit your ability to get some of my stuff. And the biggest bulldog in the world for playing this game of restrictions is China. China loves a restriction business. For years, they've been every time they don't feel that there's equitable terms between them and a certain country,
Yeah.
or there's a larger geopolitical game afoot, they will restrict market access to, and what we've seen over the past couple of months, critical minerals,
Yeah.
critical materials, magnets, all the things that we need. So, this is the game that's happening behind the scenes that I think is going to accelerate quite a bit over the next 6 months and certainly until the end of the year.
And it's funny because you talk about export limits, right? Either around volume or around what specifically can go. I think a lot of the complexity that companies, and I'll just say in the US right now, because that's where my understanding is better, is trying to read the tea leaves, read the winds, figure out what's going to change, how strict is it going to be, how much is it going to change, how much time do we have before these changes go into practice. It's really difficult to stay on top of all of this. And even if there are sort of bigger picture, longer term benefits, for instance, of not having US made semiconductor chips end up in China, for the companies based in the US that are trying to make these decisions right now, the challenge is real. This isn't just sort of a political, regardless of how you feel, you feel one way or the other about it. This is literally a strategic difficulty if you're trying to make, in some cases, short-term plans, but at the very least, mid to long term.
It totally is. And you find that there are industries where it's easier to do because they're either highly commoditized or narrowly focused within certain sectors.
Yeah.
You find some areas where it's kind of impossible to decouple or to be that rigid. And I'll give you an example. Look at the healthcare industry. There's been a lot of dialogue around how, potentially the technologies that we have in our hospital systems
Yeah.
are exposing patient data to foreign adversaries because we're importing all of these things that are tied to companies that operate in places that we're not necessarily at terms with. So is that a little bit of fear mongering? Certainly it is. But at the same rate, if there's a domestic industry that's saying, hey, I want to make these, say, MRI machines here in the United States, well, good luck. It's going to take you a lot of time and you're still going to have a global
Yeah.
supply chain for it. But where does then the regulator come in to either impose a Buy America restriction or a Make in America restriction, or any kind of regulatory regime which would decouple an industry from a certain country that is a non-ally? And I think that's very hard because if you
Yeah.
walk into a hospital, 80% of what you're seeing is either made or connected to, say, a Chinese supply chain. So what are you going to do?
Yeah.
Gut all of our hospitals? Doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
So I think in certain industries you can do it. Certain industries, I don't think it makes any sense. And frankly, and this is probably the biggest thing that I see here in Washington with all the companies that I've been advising. Sometimes the United States doesn't want to make this stuff.
Yeah.
Either we don't have the wherewithal or we don't have the desire to do it for a variety of reasons. Maybe we lost the skill set. Maybe the economics don't work. Maybe we could spend our time doing other things. But, when you have a sense of rigidity from the White House or certain agencies, and once again, this isn't a political statement, it's an empirical one, to say we need to bring all these industries back here. Well, by golly, I'm telling you, some of them are going to work and some of them are
Yeah.
definitely not going to work. So then what do? You look to those friend shoring, allied shoring. Well,
That's right.
we don't want X country to make it. We want to get it from Y country. I find it super, super interesting that the United States now is closer to a deal with India than it is with Mexico.
Mm,
That's fascinating
yeah.
because Mexico's are sure we share a border with them. Like what are you talking about? Or Canada? The United States is closer to a deal with India than it is with Canada. That's remarkable. And so I think friend shoring and allied shoring is now taking a whole other sort of identity where it's much more strategic. It's much more of a moving target, and all of these classic, traditional, conventional ways to think about trade have just gotten flipped on its head. That's the way it is.
Yeah. It's like the ultimate multi-party negotiation.
Yeah, and everyone's drunk.
So at least we're all having a good time. Hopefully, someone's taking notes about what everybody agreed to. But so let's then, and maybe that's the perfect transition to go from trade to lobbying. And I'll tell you, Samir, right up front, my procurement listeners will really appreciate whatever your answer is to this question because this is something we suffer from. How do you explain? So, as a lobbyist, how do you explain what you do for living
Yeah.
to people outside of the field? Procurement usually gets the eye glaze, but how much do you boil it down when you say what you do?
So what I do is very simple. If you're a company that has a trade issue, if you're paying a tariff that you can't afford, if you got to do layoffs, if you got a competitor that's not paying a tariff and you want them to pay a tariff,
Yep.
uh, or you're looking at things regarding supply chain that you want to see changed, you hire a lobbyist to go and sit down with government to make those changes. Very simple. So, everyone talks about there being no tariff exemptions. Well, there's no tariff exemptions. That is a flat out lie. There are tariff exemptions and carve outs happening every day
Yep.
at the White House and at the Department of Commerce and at USTR. They just don't call them carve outs and they don't call them exemptions. They call them delay in implementation,
Okay.
or they call it subject to this code and not this code, or subject to this authority and not this authority. there's a dance that's occurring.
Mm,
What lobbyists do and what I do as a trade professional is I bring these companies to sit down with the government and make a case as to why they should make policy a certain way. And I'll give you a couple quick examples of what I've done over the past 2 weeks. I had a company based in Vermont that does amazing household products come to Washington to explain to the White House why imposing a tariff on non-strategic goods with China is a bad idea, because ultimately what it does is increases prices to the average American that need affordable items for their
mm,
day-to-day lives. And that's really not the purpose or the virtue of these trade negotiations. We're trying to do something around critical industries. Why are we impacting tablecloths and candlesticks? That makes no sense. So that was an iteration that I had at the White House with a CEO. Or the week before that, I brought in a company that's in the critical mineral sector over to the Department of Commerce, because the Department of Commerce has a comment period where they say, hey, anyone who is importing critical minerals, we're about to put all of these tariffs on critical minerals. Tell me which critical minerals you want on that list and which ones you don't want on that
yeah.
list. Well, I had a company and a CEO that said, hey, here's the thing. I'm importing this very important graphite material that goes into steel making. And if I go to these steel mills in Ohio and in Indiana and in West Virginia and in Texas, and I say, hey, this critical component that you need is now double the price, they're not going to be happy with me. So in many respects, this is actually hurting the domestic steel industry,
Mm,
which the president really cares about. No problem. I sat down with the deputy assistant secretary over at the Department of Commerce. We made our case and said, I think we're trying to help the steel industry and not trying to hurt them. So while you're making this list, take that off of it. This one doesn't really make sense. And here's all the reasons why. So this is what I do on a day-to-day basis. I bring companies to Washington and we go and argue and make a case
yeah.
as to why you should not be paying a certain tariff, or why maybe a competitor or maybe a certain industry should bear the brunt of that. And then, there could be countries that, are basically conducting unfair trade practices where, the last one I'll mention is there was a company that I was advising that had a competitor in Mexico. And that Mexican factory had horrible environmental conditions. They were polluting their
Mm,
community. It resulted in many healthcare, tragedies, where really, really sad stories that were well publicized in the media. And they said, Samir, we need to go and tell the United States government that we should put this company on what they call an entity list, meaning we should not be accepting products from them,
yeah.
because not only are they doing really bad things, they're bringing it in at 40% below market costs that we make from over here. And that's totally unfair. And that's why we're not getting any of our customers anymore. And we've lost 80% market share because of this activity. Well, once again, go sit down with the right people at the agency and say, here's the bad guy. Let's go and,
Yeah.
create some trouble for them because they don't align with US priorities. So what's the hope there? That there's a restriction on those exports, and then the US company can go and recollect their market share. These are the things that I do every day.
Yeah. Now, as a lobbyist, excuse me, are there regulations that govern your actions?
Absolutely. There's something called the Lobbying Disclosure Act, which means every quarter I file a document that says who I talked to, what I talked to them about, and how much that client paid me for that
Mhm.
consulting contract. That is a routine thing that's done every quarter by every lobbyist in Washington, and there are plenty of us. And Senate Ethics and the Government Accountability Office all have oversight on those documents, and it's a standard practice. And frankly, I think they're very important. You want to know who is advocating for what, because sometimes you can get hoodwinked. I mean,
Yeah.
if a company comes in and says they want to do it for a certain reason, when really they have an alternative agenda, you'd be surprised that can happen.
Yeah.
Or say someone is representing a company, but really they're not representing a company. They're representing a country, and they should be filing something called registering as a foreign agent, or a
Yep.
FARA registration. So transparency and disclosure is incredibly important to the lobbying industry. It's something that's taken seriously, and it's done routinely.
Now, what would you say is the balance of sort of country or industry expertise that you need to have versus the power of your network, right? Who you know, who you can get to pick up a call from you. How do those two things come together to make a lobbyist successful?
I think, there's different models of trade lobbying. The first model is the access model, which is, hey, I got access to all these really cool people, and I can go bring you here. We could take a nice picture, and we can, you can go and tell your friends that you sat with this senator or this secretary, and kind of the feel good. Hey, I got the access.
Yeah.
And access based lobbying, I think, is always going to be there. That's never going to change, and it's super super important. There's another kind of lobbying which is called expertise lobbying. So say you spent the past 15 years working at the Federal Trade Commission on antitrust. Well, if I'm Amazon and I want to merge with eBay, for
Okay.
example, I might want to hire this guy
Yeah.
because he understands how the FTC thinks, and he can give me the at least a roadmap of how decisions are made, not just the access, and he's got the friends there, but he knows because he was a regulator. He knows how they think. So some people go for the access, some people go for the expertise, and you can imagine there's a lot of idiosyncratic industries where you really need that expertise, like
Yeah.
agriculture. Not everyone's going to be an expert on seeds, right, or pesticides. Healthcare, on Medicare and Medicaid pricing, and really
Yeah.
obscure things on Federal Drug Administration. You need an expert. You can't just have an access guy, because that access guy is going to be looking at a bunch of nails and he's going to think he's a hammer. Hey, I got you in the room with them. That should be enough. No,
Yeah.
it's not. I need you to explain this, and it's quite complicated. So there's the access guy, there's the expertise guy, and then there's something which is kind of the ethos that at least I've taken, and I think is fundamental, which is being the business guy.
Mm.
Say, look, I'll put it this way, Kelly. There's a lot of lawyers in Washington. There's not many MBAs, and I've built a team with a lot of MBAs, which has been great. And what we do is we take a look at your business model. So say if you're a head of procurement at a certain company that's in the let's just take it in the energy industry. And I understand where you get your widgets. I understand who your customers are. I understand what your competitors are doing and where they're buying it. I understand what the larger trends are in industry around clean energy versus renewable energy versus, traditional legacy oil and gas or coal-fired power generation. I can understand what's going on in your
Yeah.
business. Then I can go and say, actually, there's this one thing that's happening on EPA right now, which is really interesting, which impacts this downstream customer of yours. Or, hey, there's this really kind of new, interesting code that the Department of Energy is going to roll out regarding a tax incentive for production of certain widgets that go into these kinds of structures. And that could be a new business development opportunity where government could be a revenue generator for you.
Yeah.
So I think that's actually the more exciting way of conducting government affairs. The access guys are fun, and they love to have a cigar and invite you to a fundraiser, and you might be out with them until the wee hours of the night.
Yeah.
And the expertise guys, you might fall asleep 2 or 3 times, but they'll certainly get the message across.
Yeah.
But I think the real exciting ecosystem of government affairs is around those that can understand your business. Because if we can't understand your business, we're not going to be able to help you.
True. Now, you've talked about cases where CEOs or individual companies are coming in and you're helping them lobby for a cause. Do you ever find yourself in a situation where the incentive is so great to change something about the system that competitors are coming together to all lobby together for something that's a shared interest for them?
Absolutely, and you find that now more than ever, particularly within the trade ecosystem. You could imagine that the Steel Manufacturers Association, which represent all of the domestic melt and manufactured steel plants,
Yeah.
they are actively going to the White House to say, impose more tariffs on the import of steel,
Yeah.
because that increases higher demand for domestic production. And if it doesn't increase higher demand for domestic production, it at least levels the playing field. And here's what I mean by that. If the US has standards around environment, has standards around labor, has standards around electricity rates, and logistics costs, and the burdens of compliance, or what you pay in wages. I mean, the whole point is, if our costs of production are X, and the cost of production of steel in another country is X minus 50,
Yeah.
then it makes sense to add 50 to their exports. It's common sense. It's not trying to play politics. It's not trying to, hold one over on another country because of some gamesmanship. No, it's like, listen, man, it just costs me more to make this stuff
Yeah.
here. You're not subject to any of that. You got to pay more if you want to get market access. You see that those kinds of conversations play out at the association level, where they all can get kind of pack up together and
Okay.
say, we want that to be the case. Where associations are not as effective is when not everyone agrees to the same thing.
Mm,
So say you're talking about an association that represents everyone that manufactures air purification systems. Uh, Now, certain air purifiers can probably clean the air at a certain rate, and some probably at a lesser rate. I would imagine that trade association would fight a lot around what the standard should be
true.
on what to call a true product that can clean the air. And so you'll never see that association advocate with the government to say, this is the standard that we want to, if you want to call something an air purifier, this is the standard in which it needs to clean the amount of mold in the air, or X, Y, and Z. There they won't get involved because they want to please all their members,
Yeah.
and they want to make sure everyone has a say in it. So they get almost kind of not even neutral, but neutered in many cases because they can't have a position on
Yeah.
things. So it just depends. And the biggest case study right now is the United States Chamber of Commerce, which is the largest kind of trade body in the country, representing anyone you can imagine. They are super opposed to the tariffs. They're coming out every day saying, don't impose these tariffs, don't impose these tariffs, don't impose these tariffs, for all these reasons. Now, it just so happens that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has traditionally been known as a Democratic left-leaning institution, so they don't have much sway with the
Okay.
with the Trump administration. But you know who does? NAM, the National Association of
Uh,
Manufacturers.
yes.
So NAM is always in the room as a trade association with the president and with his team. They always get cited. They always get sort of they get calls before rules are made to
Yeah.
say whether they like them, and they get consulted as part of that kitchen cabinet of advisors. And it's cyclical, Kelly, but I think trade associations have a very valuable role in these trade discussions, but some are just more engaged than others by virtue of the industry or by the culture or by the membership. It just depends.
Yeah. Now, I think if there's one thing probably everybody can agree to is that we've all learned more about how trade works since January than most of us outside of the field had any idea. I think in the past, if trade had come up in a conversation, it would have been like, okay, file under policy wonk. Like this is not my deal, but it's above the fold every single day. It's every breaking news. It's every single hot story that comes across our phones as a notification. I'd be interested in your perspective. So you've been doing this for a while, right? We had Trump's first term 2 terms ago, right? We went through the Biden administration, but you've done this long enough. Do you find that this being so front and center is truly changing the way you do your job, changing the regard that people have for the role that you play from the way things have happened in the past? Maybe still as importantly, but a little bit less in the limelight.
Well, trade never used to be the sexiest thing in DC. I'm not saying that I've gotten sexier, Kelly, but I'm getting more phone calls, which is good. Um,
We'll take it as a proxy.
as a proxy. But no, I'll say, look, there's a high demand right now
Mm,
for trade professionals in Washington, people that have been doing this for a long time that get it, that yes, this authority means that, or this tariff is stackable with this one and not with
yeah,
that one, or this actually is better under an anti-dumping countervailing duty case than it is under a Section 232 investigation, or hey, this is actually the person within the USTR that's going to make the decision on this, or this is the person within the Department of Commerce that has the pen on this
yeah,
particular order or case. Yes, there's high demand for that practical, on the ground intelligence, knowledge, and forecasting. Um, I think my job has changed a bit over the years. I've done this for 12 years now, in the sense uh, you have to know how to have massive empathy. And here's what I mean by that. I've talked to hundreds and I mean hundreds of CEOs this year about their trauma regarding supply chain.
Yeah.
I've seen businesses shut down. I've seen hundreds of people laid off. I've seen credit dried up in days. I've seen shipments that haven't been able to be offloaded because payments couldn't be made. I've seen some really bad scenarios for really good people that are my community. Like I'm a part of the procurement community. You know, these are the people I've worked with for a long time. And I've seen some really bad stories, Kelly. And I think the one thing that I've had to really embrace this year is empathy, and to understand what they're going through and how I can be helpful. And it's not just around, platforms like India Index, which once again we offer for free, and anyone can sign up and get a supply chain partner in India in seconds. But it's also around the way that we make cases to the government, and they're not always going to listen, but they're always going to hear, and that's important. And there's a few trends that I've learned this year that are important and that are meaningful, that play into that empathy. The first is, you have to be able to communicate severe economic harm. If you have significant challenges with your supply chain, and you're just leaving it at that, that's not good enough. Like, you need to talk about job losses, potential shutting down of operations, potential loss of contracts, potential losses of access to credit, things that show severe economic harm. You got to be able to clarify that, because that's how you can get government to understand what you're going through. The other things are around, we talked about national security. If you need to get certain products or widgets in because you're making something that's critical to national security, then you need to make that case. And you need to be upfront as to why that's important. And there's a lot of industries that fall under the national security umbrella, whether that's pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, steel and aluminum, copper, automotive. Like, there's a lot. Like, don't think national security is just about jets and
tanks
and
and yeah.
It's not. It's not. There's a lot of things that fall under national security. So thinking about how you're a part of that national security ecosystem, like I'll give you an example, a brake rotor company. In this administration, brake rotors are a part of national security. So how do you make that argument? Two other things quickly, domestic scarcity.
Yeah.
If you literally can't get it here, how do you really show the data and make the impact to make that clear? And then the last one is, and this is where you kind of I put on my lobbyist hat, is be prepared to name and shame the government if they do you wrong. And I'll give you an anecdote. I was at a government office not too long ago, and I'll be careful about what I share.
Sure.
But a trade association individual came in to this office and showed a map of U.S. farmland and said, if this tariff continues to exist, we have to burn down this much square acreage of farmland. And it was a lot of farmland, Kelly. And the next statement was, and I don't think you want to see that in the press. And you know what happened? Not even 24 hours later, that specific issue was remedied by those in the government. So don't be afraid to be bold, but all through the lens of empathy. You want people to understand what you're going through. And that is very important to narrative building.
Yeah. Which to me is absolutely fascinating, because if you connect that back to, being an MBA oriented lobbyist, right? You need all of those business skills. You have to have the data. You have to know to show the map, but being able to tell the story that goes with the ask, incredibly powerful. I mean, certainly in your world, but I would think for anybody in business that's trying to get big things done, you have to be able to combine the business case with the analytics. And to your point, the empathy that's necessary to get people to side with you.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. And a lot of people equate what we do to almost like a communications or public relations or public affairs type role. But instead of our audience being journalists and those that are on broadcast networks to try to get, stories placed, we're talking with government officials who literally control the destiny of the United
Yeah.
States.
Yep. Well, Samir, as always, an incredibly fascinating conversation. I appreciate your frankness. I appreciate your willingness to sort of pull back the curtain and give us a sense of what's going on. If people would like to connect with you, follow you, potentially even learn more about India Index, what is the best way for them to get more information?
Well, thank you again for having me, Kelly. I
Yeah.
always love being on your show. You can email me at Samir at indiaindex.com. Happy to give you a free access to India Index so you can find a supplier in India in seconds. And if you're ever in Washington, you can look for a company called Vogel Group. We're pretty close by in the West End of DC. And as always, I can provide my contact details with your guests via your posts.
Awesome. Samir, thank you so much for being back.
Love it. Thanks again, Kelly.